Hello again, and welcome back to one of our online lectures here in World History. As we continue our unit on the Middle Ages, we're going to look today at our outcome being Germanic Kingdoms emerge and Charlemagne. And really what that refers to is once Rome falls, we see all these Germanic groups, the Vandals, Visigoths, Lombards, Saxons, and the Franks, taking over different pieces of Europe. And we're going to focus on the Franks today. So we're going to look at their kingdom emerge, and then we're going to look at one of the most powerful leaders of the Middle Ages named Charlemagne. But really, when we look at this, we're actually going to look at three different leaders. And our constructive response question asks just that. So our question says, distinguish the differences between Clovis, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne, as well as some of their accomplishments. So we're actually going to look at three different individuals today, but we'll focus a little bit more on Charlemagne. All three of them were important Frankish leaders, as you're about to find out. So if we look at our path to learning, what will we learn here today? We're going to talk a little bit about Germanic culture, so we'll see kind of how these Germanic people changed Europe with their way of life. But then I told you we're going to focus on these three guys. We'll talk about how Clovis unites the Franks, how Charles Martel defeats the Moors, and we're going to see all sorts of great things about Charlemagne. So that's where we're going with all this today. We're going to start by looking at a map here of Europe. And as I mentioned, we have lots of different groups that moved into Roman lands. Mentioned we have the Franks, there's the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, Vandals, Saxons, Visigoths. There's a whole bunch of them. And they really disrupted life for people in Europe. And when that happens, life changes. As we saw with the first notes that we took, loss of learning, cities were abandoned, common language disappeared, there was no organized government. So Europe really was very, very different when these Germanic people moved in. So let's talk a little bit about these Germanic kingdoms. So in the upheaval between 400 and 600, roughly going from the fall of Rome to about 100 to 200 years beyond that, several small Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman provinces. Of course, none of these are going to be as strong as the Roman Empire, but several of them will kind of stake their claim in some of the Roman lands. Borders changed constantly. There was never really an established kingdom or empire in the years following the Romans, just because the Germanic people often fought each other and there was just not any true country that developed. That's not going to happen for nearly 1,000 years as we get towards the end of the Middle Ages. Within the Germanic kingdoms, you have to understand, they couldn't read or write, so their allegiances were a little bit different. Family ties and personal loyalty were far more important than public government and written law. So you basically were there to fight next to your family, protect your family and your friends, but it had nothing to do with being conscripted into military service, writing laws, anything like that. So very, very different than what the Romans believed in. So this Germanic stress on personal ties made it basically impossible to establish orderly government. But I think the big wrinkle in that is also the fact that these Germanic people didn't read or write. So they wouldn't have written their laws down, nor would they have had like a public center to conduct laws or write laws or things like that. So again, what we're dealing with here is a culture that's very different from that of the Romans. Now, what we're going to actually look at in our story today is the three C's. We're going to look at three individuals that come out of the group called the Franks, all that start with the name C. We're going to start with Clovis, we're going to move on to Charles Martel, and then we're ultimately going to finish with Charlemagne. As you see from this map here, the Franks had power in Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France and a little bit of Switzerland. So when we talk about the Frankish kingdom, think of France. I mean, look at the name Franks. It almost says France. In fact, the name France actually comes from the Franks. So let's talk about Clovis. Clovis was the leader of the Franks. They were a pretty small group of warriors, and Clovis is really going to change them. And one of the ways he's going to change them is with this new religion that had been growing and growing ever since the time of the Romans. So Christianity really became a very important part of the Middle Ages. In fact, it was the constant variable in the Middle Ages. And what I mean by that is, as empires rose and fell, different groups of people came and left. Obviously the Romans were gone. Christianity stuck around. It was always there. So it was the constant variable in the Middle Ages. So Clovis is going to bring Christianity to the region. Clovis believed in Christianity. Clovis was a Christian. And really, what happens is he's fighting another Germanic tribe and he fears defeat. He feels like he's going to be defeated by this Germanic tribe, and he decides to appeal to the Christian God. Well, by asking God for help, he finds out that the battle shifts in his favor and the Franks win the battle. So naturally, as a believer in Christianity, he goes, wow, this is amazing. Christianity must really be the real deal. And so he decides to go ahead and have his 3,000 warriors, his 3,000 soldiers, baptized. In essence, he basically forces them to become Christian. So Clovis and his 3,000 warriors ask a bishop to baptize them. So what he's now in effect doing is making the Franks more Christian. He's spreading Christianity. By 511, Clovis had united the Franks into one kingdom. They believed in him. They saw him as a strong leader. He was definitely going to be their Christian leader. All right, a Frankish empire evolves. The Franks now controlled the largest and strongest of Europe's kingdoms. And again, when I'm talking about kingdoms, these are not big. These are small pieces of what used to be Rome, run by different Germanic tribes. The Franks just happen to be the one that stands out. They had the most warriors, they had the most land, and the most territory. So when Clovis died in 511, the Franks controlled most of modern-day France. It's a very good piece of land. It's good for farming. There's several rivers there. So it's definitely a good piece of property for the Franks to control. Again, we're looking at right in here. You can see the Frankish kingdom here in yellow. Now, what's kind of interesting about the way the Franks operated is they had a title that was kind of unique to the Franks. You don't really see this in a lot of other places. So there's the Frankish position of mayor of the palace. Let me tell you a little bit about what the mayor of the palace did. In essence, it was a position that in some cases had become more powerful than the king in these Frankish kingdoms. Kind of depending on who was mayor of the palace and who was king, the person could actually manipulate power and become very, very powerful. So the official power of the mayor of the palace was that you had charge of the royal households and estates, kind of like a lord. You had land. That's typically when you hear the word lord in a non-religious context, that means you own land. And so you controlled royal households, you kind of ran things for the king. So you had a lot of official power in that regard. However, as we see, some of these mayor of the palaces actually, because of their influence with the king, unofficially could lead armies and could actually make policy, in some cases essentially ruling the kingdom. And this matters because as we talk about the next person on our list, we're going to find out that this guy, Charles Martel, or the guy with the coolest name ever, Charles the Hammer Martel, who was mayor of the palace under the Franks, became a very, very important person here in the Middle Ages. So let's talk a little bit about what Charles Martel does. By 719, Charles, as mayor of the palace, held more power than the king. And it's what he does with that power that really makes him a big deal. Now you have to remember, Charles was part of the Franks. Therefore, the Franks, because they were Christian, made him Christian. So Charles is definitely going to be a man who wants to spread Christianity. And he's going to do so by fighting the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, which is in Spain. So Charles gets his fame by defeating Muslim raiders from Spain at the Battle of Tours in 732. This takes place right in here. This map's really small. Right in here is where the Franks were. This is Gaul. This is modern-day France. Over here is Spain. So you can see this little area right here. Now what would happen is these Muslim raiders would actually come up through Africa, and they were trying to infiltrate into Europe. They were trying to spread Islam in that region, and Charles stops them. Now, historians argue that if the Christians had lost this battle, if Charles had lost this battle, Muslims would have had at least a foothold in Europe and may have been able to take over Europe. So the modern world could look very, very different today if Islam had spread through Europe, because as we're going to find out later this semester in the Age of Exploration, as Europeans left Europe, they brought Christianity with them, and they colonized the globe and brought Christianity all over the place. And that's part of the reason why Christianity is the most populous religion on the planet today. So Charles wins, which makes Charles a Christian hero. Christianity wins. It's really a big turning point for Europe and for the Christians. Again, things could have been very, very different in the eyes of history had he lost. At his death, he passed his power on to Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short wasn't necessarily short, but you get these names. A lot of times you didn't have last names in the Middle Ages. For example, my name is Carl. I would be Carl from Elk River. I wouldn't have the last name Sagan because last names really didn't exist. So you got nicknames for various reasons. So at his death, he passed power to his son, Pepin the Short. Now, the reason Pepin's somewhat remarkable is not so much for what he did, but it's more so for the title that he gets. So the Pope, who is the head of the Catholic Church, anointed Pepin. Anointed means he gave Pepin this title called King by the Grace of God. And what that did is it kind of started to blur the lines. Who's got power here? Who can give power? Who can take power away? That's going to kind of play into Charlemagne's story here in a little bit. But Pepin was anointed king by the grace of God, thus beginning the Carolingian dynasty, a family that would rule the Franks from 751 to 987 AD. It's this dynasty which is where we get Charlemagne from. Here's a picture of the Battle of Tours. It's Charles right there in the middle, defeating the Muslim raiders. Right here. All right, we're going to end there. When we come back, we're going to talk about Charlemagne. So go ahead and hit stop and cue up part 2.